In this video, we're going to examine a court transcript regarding the cross-examination of Dr. Dewi Evans in the case of child P. I think this is something that hasn't been seen before. Before we go into that, I'm going to go over the details related to child P. So the allegation here is that air was injected into the stomach of child P via the nasogastric tube, which caused gastric distension and splinting of the diaphragm, leading to collapse. As is noted here, the allegation has since been changed to air was later injected into his intravenous line to cause air embolism, collapse and death. Now, of course, you're not going to hear anything about the second sentence in this court case because Dr. Evans relies on the first explanation, because he's abandoned since the splinting of the diaphragm nasogastric tube theory for child C, child I and child P. That of course is fairly extraordinary in and of itself. So I'll also go over the details for child P. The initial gaseous distension of the abdomen was caused by CPAP and not by injection of air into the nasogastric tube. It is unclear whether the nasogastric tube was open to drainage. The care of child P after the collapse on the 24th of June was mismanaged and there were unacceptable delays in recognition and treatment of the pneumothorax. So I'll just explain a couple of things here. Firstly, pneumothorax is a collapsed lung, and secondly, this is yet another example, as I've discussed in a previous video, of misdiagnosis. So this is one of the most fundamental things that you can ever do wrong in medicine, is misdiagnose something, because if you don't diagnose something correctly, your possibility of treating it is pretty limited. Delay in the treatment of the pneumothorax, which has occurred due to the misdiagnosis, led to persistent metabolic acidosis because of persistent poor circulation and gas exchange caused by the pneumothorax. So what I would just reflect on briefly at this point is that what you see in these panels' explanations is that one mistake led to another and these had knock-on effects. So you're seeing a clear, systematic clinical explanation for what has occurred to these infants. With Dr. Evans, he just comes up with a theory and then says, oh, this is what must have happened. It is unclear whether the pneumothorax preceded or followed the resuscitation. Pneumothorax can occur in preterm infants with mild respiratory distress syndrome, especially with CPAP or other respiratory support, or even without any lung disease or respiratory support at all. The medical records do not show that a cold light test was performed. So this is an example of a cold light test. It's just a trans illumination of the chest, and it's just to reveal things that can't be seen by the naked eye, essentially. Child P was treated with high pressure ventilation and adrenaline despite having no lung disease and requiring only 26% oxygen. So I don't know if this was a mistake of diagnosis, but we see other cases. Indeed, child P is one of 3 triplets with child O, and child O was also mistreated with high pressure ventilation that was inappropriate. Both are harmful because high ventilation pressures impede venous return to the heart, resulting in worsening circulatory failure, and adrenaline punishes the heart by overworking it unnecessarily. There were no signs of air embolism at final collapse, which you would obviously expect. So you can see across this description, as I mentioned, it's just one mistake that compounds something, then that will create a clinical condition, then they make another mistake, things get worse, and so on. The infant collapses, and you have this very regrettable outcome. So just to summarise, child P died from pneumothorax that was suboptimally managed. There was no evidence of air injection into the stomach or the intravenous line. I'll just mention as well that you can see that pneumothorax is critical in the collapse and sad demise of child P. This is not the only case where Dr. Evans refused to cite a pneumothorax and decided that air was more important, because this occurred in the case of child H. As you see on the screen here, there were repeated and lengthy delays in diagnosis and treatment for the tension pneumothorax. Yet again, a problem with diagnosis here. And poor placement of chest tubes with ineffectual removal of air in the chest. So it's the usual thing. They don't diagnose it correctly, then they make medical errors, then they don't carry out basic procedures correctly, that exacerbates the situation, and that is what happened over and over again with these infants. In this case, this resulted in the reaccumulation of air in the chest and continuing clinical deterioration. So not only in the case of child H was the medical mismanagement of the tension pneumothorax significant, but it was recognised in court by a prosecution witness that care of the pneumothorax was suboptimal. Yet Dr. Evans still tried to come up with something else for this infant. I believe this is the one where he goes for smothering and suggests that Lucy's tried to smother the infant because he couldn't make air fit the clinical signs on this occasion. So he already has previous in this case for ignoring a pneumothorax and saying, oh, that's not relevant, I've decided it's this instead. So I wanted to give a bit of context before we begin. I will now go into the cross-examination of Dr. Evans in relation to child P. So we're going to begin here with baby P. This day's cross-examination of Evans also began with a discussion of something else that I'll probably cover at some point, but we're just going to look at child P here. So Ben Myers is cross-examining Dr. Evans here, and he begins by saying, let's move then to baby P and evidence relating to him, please. We know that there was a collapse round about 9:40 to 9:50, round about that time on the 24th of June. That's a fact, a set fact. We're in agreement with that, aren't we? Yes, Evans replies. We know that despite interventions there followed, amongst other things, a series of collapses and overall a worsening of condition during the day. Correct. Which sadly led to baby P's death later that day. Yes. What I would like to do first is just to look at some aspects of the response to the first collapse and look at what you're able to say about the collapse itself, so we can be quite clear, the response itself first and then the collapse. You have seen in the x-ray, in fact, the one we've just looked at, that there is a right-sided pneumothorax identified in that x-ray timed at 11:57. Yes. It's your view, isn't it, that it is reasonable to consider that the pneumothorax that we see was a consequence of the resuscitation procedure? That is the most likely sequence, yes. So with regard to this, I'll just say that we don't know for certain whether or not it was a consequence of the resuscitation because that hasn't been established. This was mentioned in the panel report already. The panel say it's a distinct possibility. We would need to know various things that are not currently available. Evans has said here this is the most likely sequence. I'm sure he said in his report that's definitely the case. He usually does. And again, just so it's clear, that's something that you identified in your report, the second report, 2nd of June 2018, and your report in March 2019. Yes. Your opinion is that, or you suspected that, the pneumothorax increased significantly between 11:57 and 12:40. That's a possibility, yes. What you say in the report, the main one that we've looked at, your report the 2nd of June 2018, is that you suspect it increased significantly between 11:57 and 12:40. And then in your third report, actually on the 24th of March 2019, you go as far as to say it's likely that it increased significantly. Yes. So this is just Myers establishing that Evans has written multiple reports, as he does for essentially every infant, and that he alters his opinion over time. Now, a legitimate question to ask would be, why is he altering his opinion when there's no new medical information? He doesn't make any effort to find out anything additional. We know the obstetric notes were never required. We know maternity notes were never required. We know background information from the hospital was never required. So he's always got the same information, but yet he's writing multiple reports and changing his opinion on things. What information? So he said here by Myers that he changed his view regarding the pneumothorax, essentially. So the question would be, on what basis did Evans do that, given that he had no further information at that time? But let's continue. All right, and you say in that third report on the 24th of March 2019 that the deterioration at 12:28 reflects how it is likely to have increased significantly between 11:57 and 12:40. It's a possibility. Right. In the three reports that you provided us, the first on the 21st of November 2017, the second in 2018 and the third in 2019, you formed the view that the pneumothorax could have contributed to a failure in resuscitation even after the lung had been reinflated. That was my feeling at the time. Now, so this is a very significant statement he's about to make here. I couldn't think of any other reason why resuscitation was not successful. So, of course, it's not his job to think of things. That's not how medicine works. You don't just sit there thinking about what you can come up with to explain something. You apply medical knowledge and you apply established precedent. And you look through the symptoms and you look through the clinical signs. Someone who's obviously medically qualified will do a much better explanation than me of explaining this. But you don't just sit there thinking, oh, well, I can't think of a reason resuscitation wasn't successful. Oh, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Let's float this idea. Let's say this. Oh, coincidentally, all of these ideas result ultimately in Lucy Letby having harmed the infant. Your view in all three of those reports was that death was the result of complications from that pneumothorax. That was your view in all three reports, wasn't it? Yes. So what Myers is establishing here is that Evans has written multiple reports stating essentially what the expert panel has said was that this pneumothorax, Dr. Evans has said complications, they have said poor management. You can guarantee his reports were rubbish compared to the expert panel. But if an infant has a pneumothorax, clearly that's very serious. Obviously that's serious. Let alone for these types of infants that are premature, low birth weight, etc., etc. So that would be a very kind of facile conclusion to draw, a straightforward inference from the medical information that is available. And Dr. Evans has written this in three reports, and of course it's now an international panel report. As you may not be surprised to learn, and as we've gone over already, he ultimately changed his opinion on this infant. Because despite reinflation, probably that compromised child peace circulation and prevented adequate reoxygenation. Yes, that is something that does happen in a situation involving babies with pneumothorax, yes. I've simply gone through what's in the reports, and that's why I wanted to ask you about that aspect of what you said, Dr. Evans. I would like to turn from that to the question of the cause of the collapse in the first place and how far we can get with that. Yesterday, when you gave evidence, you began this passage by saying you were at a loss to explain how he came to collapse. That was the starting point. Do you agree with that? Yes. On the basis, first of all, that you don't identify any medical cause, are we talking about the final collapse or all the collapses? We're talking about how the collapses began. The 9:40 collapse, yes. So we can be quite clear. I've gone through the resuscitation procedure and what you said about that in your reports. Now we're looking at that initial collapse at 9:40 and what the cause is, and your evidence is you were at a loss to explain how that collapse came about. That's the starting point, isn't it? Yes. You don't identify any medical reason for it, as in a clinical reason, a medical cause. Is that correct? I am not sure in which report, because he's written so many, he can't actually remember what he's written, but I comment on infusion of air into the stomach, into the abdomen, at some stage. I'm not sure which one. And I use the term splinting the diaphragm in one of my reports. He can't even remember what he's written. Let's remind you as well, not only can he not even remember what he's written, or what report he's introduced this theory, but also he's now abandoned this theory completely. But he now says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I've abandoned this theory. All that matters is I've decided that there was inflicted harm. That's all that matters. So we'll abandon it. We'll forget about this pneumothorax thing, which I've cited. We'll just forget about that completely, and we'll just say, oh, Lucy Letby injected air. What you actually see with Evans here, in this case, is that he's sort of saying, oh, well, I have to acknowledge the pneumothorax because that's very obviously the reason the infant has collapsed. But, we'll just throw in the air as well and just say, oh, Lucy's injected air as well. And that splintered the diaphragm. Oh, no, wait a minute, it hasn't splintered the diaphragm, and it wasn't the nasogastric tube, it was somewhere else. I'm going to come to that. I'm being quite particular. What you said yesterday, and I'm simply acknowledging this, you don't identify any natural explanation for death. Let me put it that way. Oh, none, no. Right. What you are focused on is, first of all, gas in the abdomen in that radiograph at 20:09. So, what I just mentioned, I should probably mention briefly, is it's debatable what you would describe as a natural explanation. A collapsed lung, whether that would come under the description of a natural explanation or not, I'm not really sure. I think I'm right in saying that a natural explanation would be something that originates from medical or bodily explanations, um, or causes. So I think it would be deemed a natural explanation as far as I'm aware. So if they're talking about the radiograph at 2009, Dr. Evans confirms that this is significant in his so-called diagnosis. And you said yesterday you wonder whether that was natural or not. Correct. So notice he wonders. He wonders whether it was natural or not. He can't say, because the air can be there inadvertently. The air is present in numerous infants. We know this from Professor Arthur's study. Air does not have to be injected into an infant in order to be present. Indeed, in the overwhelming majority of cases, of course, it hasn't been injected. And another thing that's really important to understand is that this post-mortem air, unless this X-ray is taken a very short period of time after the demise of the infant, is irrelevant, because it can be there for numerous natural reasons, and indeed that is overwhelmingly likely to be the reason why the air is present. Leaving aside the fact that in order to cite this air, you have to ignore all the clinical signs of the infant. But let's continue. That is something that you considered through your reports. I'm not disagreeing with that. That's something you considered, isn't it? I thought there was a lot of gas in my report state. I can't remember the exact term. You say you were suspicious of a large volume of air noted in the stomach and intestines on the X-ray. Yes. And you say that in all three of those reports. I thought there was an awful lot of air in the intestines on that X-ray. Yes. You suggest the air could have splintered the diaphragm. So this is a fantastic Dr. Evans response you're going to hear here. Right. I said that, and sorry if it doesn't read properly, but the splinting the diaphragm is a matter that if it's not clear, let's make it absolutely clear, is a matter that I think occurred on the following morning on the 24th of June. Well, let's have a look at exactly what you said. I'm looking first of all in your second report, Dr. Evans, the main one we looked at, of 2nd of June 2018, your paragraph 30. Yes, it's at page 3835 of the statements. Are you there, Dr. Evans? What you say is this. I remain suspicious of the large volume of air noted in the stomach and intestines found on X-ray. And let's be clear, you're talking about the 2009 X-ray. It may be the sequence of events was this. The excess air into the stomach and intestines splintered the diaphragm. Then you go on to say this would have compromised Child P's breathing, leading to his collapse. You're quite clear there that the splinting of the diaphragm is the excess air in the stomach, aren't you, when you wrote that report? I did, yes. Let's just reiterate once more, this has now all been completely abandoned by Dr. Evans, because when this was put forward as a mechanism, he was essentially completely humiliated by neonatologists who dismissed it as complete rubbish. So none of this actually applies even to the arcane theories of Dr. Evans anymore. This is just something that he said in court at the time. And then when you went on to write the third report on the 24th of March 2019, could you turn, please, to your paragraph 30 in that report? Paragraph 14 in that report. Yes. What you say there is, I remain suspicious of the large volume of air noted in the stomach and intestines found on X-ray. It may be the sequence of events was this. The excess air in the stomach and intestines splintered the diaphragm. This would have compromised Child P's breathing, leading to his collapse. That's what you say, isn't it? Ben Myers states to Evans, and Evans agrees, yes. You also then go on to say, in fact, in your second and your third reports, that it is necessary to scrutinise nursing care during the night shift of the 23rd and into the 24th of June. You're clear about that? Absolutely, yes. So at this point, I want to take you back to 2017. This is from the Hummingbird document that I've analysed on the channel previously. And we see at this point Dr. Evans saying which room was the baby in for the time the nurse was on shift. So this is a general question that he has for each baby. What other babies were in the room? What medical staff were in that room for the duration of the shift? And so on and so forth. This is not his business. This is not what he should be doing. He should be looking at the medical notes and making a diagnosis on the basis of medical opinion. It's clear from this that it had been indicated to him that there was a nurse suspect. We don't know whether he knew the name of Lucy Letby at this point. He maintains that he did not know the name of Lucy Letby at this point. But this is not a question that he needs to ask. So, you see, when he's speaking in court on Child P, once he's managed to decide for this case that it's not a pneumothorax, it's the injection of air that's splinting the diaphragm, you note that he says immediately, we need to know what nurse was on duty. He doesn't say, we need to know what medical staff were on duty. I just want that point to be noted. So then Ben Myers continues. You also then go on to say, in fact, in your second and your third reports that it is necessary to scrutinise nursing care during the night shift of the 23rd and into the 24th of June. You're clear about that? Absolutely yes. So let me emphasise again. He doesn't say medical care, he doesn't mention doctors, he doesn't mention consultants, he just says that it's necessary to scrutinise nursing care in multiple reports. So you're suggesting that air in the stomach and intestines at 20:09 on the 23rd was sufficient and is an explanation to cause splinting of the diaphragm that led to a collapse at about 9:40 the following morning, aren't you? So this is a long answer here from Dr. Evans. That was the option at the time, yes, that was the option at the time. So that statement to me immediately says what I mentioned earlier. He just sits there thinking, oh, we could say this, we could say that. Maybe I should claim that this is the reason for the collapse. It's not a case of looking at your options and saying which option should I use to come to the conclusion that I want to ultimately draw. What you're supposed to do is look at the medical signs of the infant and then diagnose on the basis of those medical signs and get as much clinical information as you can. Of course you should look at the context of the hospital. Of course you should have the obstetric notes. Of course you should have the maternity notes. That goes without saying. And you pull all this together and then you draw the most likely conclusion that you can based on the information that you have. That is what diagnosis is. It's not like, oh, there's a few options, right, this is the best option I've got. And to discount the pneumothorax in this infant, as he already did with child H, in an even more ridiculous fashion arguably, although not much more ridiculous than this, because this is certainly ridiculous, it's just untenable, really. I don't think that's now correct. Oh, really? Tell us more, Dave. I think it's more likely that there was excess air in the X-ray of the 20:09 of the night before. I think that destabilised the baby. I think that's why he was unable to take his feeds properly. But given what we now know and what we've heard from the local people who saw him and who gave evidence over the last few days, so that's what he always does. He puts up some absolute bullshit in his report. After he's put this absolute bullshit in the report, he's called out on it. Then he tries to concoct some sort of explanation for why his report has some form of legitimacy. And then he says, oh, but now I've heard from these local doctors. I didn't have this information previously. The reason I didn't have this information is because over the 5 years that I've worked on this case, I never bothered to seek out any contextual information. I never looked at the maternity notes. I never looked at the neonatal obstetric notes. I never found out anything about the hospital. I came... The first time I even know there was sewage was an issue at the hospital was when John Sweeney told me. I never bothered to find that out. In his defence, that I believe that was hidden to some extent by the hospital, but it was discussed in court, of course. So this is his kind of last leaning post, is to say, oh, local people have said this and local people have said that, and based on that, there can't possibly be any explanation other than, he's actually changing his diagnosis now, even though none of them have said anything of any relevance. There's no clinical basis for this whatsoever. He just says, oh, based on these things that I've heard in court, although I didn't hear everything in court because I wasn't here all the time. Like, by his own admission, he buggers off after a certain point of time. So he doesn't hear anything. He does everything, rather. He doesn't hear stuff from the defence. He didn't hear about the sewage because he wasn't there. But, based on what I've vaguely heard while I'm in the other room, I'll just say, yeah, I think there was additional amount of air given, which is exactly what he says here. I think there was an additional amount of air given to this baby during the morning of the 24th of June, and that this additional air is what splintered the diaphragm and caused the collapse. So he is saying that now, on the hoof, in court, during this statement, based on stuff that he's randomly heard when he's sitting in another room. I mean, it's complete crap. It's disgusting. I don't know how else you could describe it other than disgusting. So I think that there were two events. So I think there was excess air given before the 20:09 X-ray, if I could put it that way. Then I think that destabilised the baby, but I think he had even more air given into his stomach on the morning of the 24th. That, I think, is a more accurate way of explaining the sequence of events. Well, first of all, Dr. Evans, Ben Myers continues, what you said in all 3 reports, in fact, about a suspiciously large volume of air in the stomach the night before, you were very clear about, weren't you? Yes, yes. So what he's establishing here is that he's changed his opinion again. Although now he's even changed his opinion away from this, of course. Secondly, we'll look at this on the notes. That doesn't make any sense at all, actually, does it? What you were saying on the notes you've had throughout, the clinical notes. I've had a whinge or two about the quality of those notes I got, but anyway, let's forget about that. So that is actually a legitimate comment. So I know for a fact that the medical notes were very poor, and that's not an unreasonable statement that he's made there. However, he didn't request additional notes. I know that for a fact. I mean, that's my problem. We're going back to 2017. This is one of the last cases I did. So bear in mind again, he's had time to do this. He's had 5 years. When this is taking place, this is 6 years after he began this process. So he had a very long time to request extra details, to look at the hospital contextually. This was the best he could do in those 5 years. This is one of the last cases I did. I think it's worth noting that in each of these cases, I make a statement that it's prepared on the understanding I will prepare a supplementary report in the event of a need to respond to any questions arising from this report or where I receive additional information. I have said that in each of my reports. An awful lot of the information that we now know is information that's come out in this trial. So therefore, I think it's unrealistic to expect anybody to form a view that is absolutely correct in each of these cases. I wish I could, but the most recent of these reports is 2019. That's 4 years ago. So I've referenced this in my book, the fact that he said, well, I can't be expected to be absolutely correct. And what I'll do is I'll just say in court, oh, we've heard from people from the hospitals, and now I'll just say this is the case. And that is literally what he's done. He's changed his opinion over and over again. Now it's contradicted by this. Then it's changed from that to another. Then he said this. Then he's abandoned this. But then he just ultimately says, oh, but I've heard a few things said in court, so now I'll just change my opinion again. And hey, I can't be expected to get everything right. I only had 5 years to do it, and the medical notes were no good. I mean, I didn't seek the maternity notes. In fact, I explicitly asked not to be sent the maternity notes. I made no effort to look at the obstetric notes. But hey, a few random people have said completely unrelated things in court that you couldn't possibly, unless they were giving you some really significant diagnostic information that hasn't been given. They don't have any further insight into this because they didn't do anything at the time. All they did was say, oh, we don't know why the baby collapsed, or we thought everything was fine. They didn't give any specific diagnostic information that would allow you to change your medical opinion. Absolutely not. So he continues. The third one is 4 years ago. We're now in March 2023, and all of these, so therefore we have I have a far better understanding of the clinical sequence of events in this particular case. Based on what? On what basis do you have a far better understanding of the clinical sequence of events? That isn't even written in his report. So therefore, the sequence, there was excess air given to this baby preceding 2009. Okay, I think that was concerning. It was sufficient for me to express concern. I was more concerned about the night shift issues regarding the failure to take milk, etc. He had a bradycardia as well, so therefore that was the real concerning point from my point of view. And then we go to 9:40 where he collapsed, but I don't think he would have collapsed but for his having an additional injection of air into his stomach during the morning of 24th of June. That is my opinion. So basically, that is all Dr. Evans trying to justify why his opinion shifts from one report to another and why he's changing it again now in court. Of course, he's now abandoned this again completely. So Lord only knows what he's written in his new reports, and Lord only knows how he can possibly justify the fact that he's abandoned everything that he previously considered to be quote-unquote suspicious, and now he's citing a completely different mechanism. It'd be interesting to see how he did that, and eventually, hopefully, in the fullness of time, we'll actually get to see those reports. Whether they'll ever be released into the public domain, I don't know, but they definitely should be. What you have done, Dr. Evans, is having been very clear as to when you say the air first accumulated in your 3 reports, you've simply now shunted it along the line to a point near to, as it happens, when Miss Letby was on duty after the 8 o'clock handover in the morning. That's actually what you have done, isn't it? And I would say that is absolutely what he's done. Of course, he's now going to deny this. It isn't actually, because if I was trying to put Miss Letby in the frame, I would have started my concerning issues not on the night shift where the milk was aspirated, but I'd have started my concern on the day shift of the previous day when I understand she was on a call. I didn't do that, so I can't be accused of putting anybody in the frame because my initial concerns related to people on the night shift of the 23rd/24th. Then the collapse occurred on the day shift. Now, anybody who was, any nurse or doctor who was on the night shift on the 23rd or 24th of June would not be on the day shift. So let me point out something very important here. You say any nurse or doctor, but you didn't ask for them to look for the doctors. You just asked them to look for nursing staff. So you already knew that there was a nurse suspect because you eliminated the doctors from your investigation. And any doctor or nurse, so we've already mentioned, Dewi, the doctors are not relevant because you asked them to look for nurses, who was on the day shift of the 24th of June would not have been on the night shift. Therefore, in looking at my report, I was expressing concerns about the care that Child P had received on the night shift and on the day shift. Looking back at it, I think that the air in his stomach at 20:09 was significant and not the result of anything natural. On what basis would you say that? On what basis would you say that the air in the stomach was not anything natural? Do you have any reason to say that? Because usually the air is going to be present accidentally. We know from the Professor Arthur study that this happens with some frequency. We also know there's a paper from Quisling that's been cited by more than one person I've spoken with who have neonatal and paediatric experience, that post-mortem air is irrelevant after a very short period of time because it can be there inadvertently for numerous reasons. You cannot rule that out. You have no basis to do that. That's why you're saying, I think that the air. Why? Why do you think that the air was not the result of anything natural? Why do you think that? You have to justify that. You cannot justify that because there's no medical basis for saying that. The only reason for saying that is if the air is not present naturally, that it justifies inflicted harm. There is no other basis for making that statement. So he goes on to mention CPAP and Optiflow and various other things. And then he says, what I did not say was, I think someone squirted lots of air into his stomach before that. I didn't say that, but looking back on it, I think this was the start of the destabilisation. So what you did do, Dr. Evans, is you cited a completely different incident in multiple reports, and then you've just changed that by your own admission based on what you've heard in the court case randomly while you're not even sitting in court yourself. So Ben Myers continues, what, the 2009 air in the abdomen? So then Evans says, yes, I think so. I didn't say that in my report. I stuck with the night staff. But looking back on it, I think that the destabilisation had occurred before that. So he didn't say this in his report, of course, but now he's stood in a court case trying to get someone sent to prison forever on the basis of stuff that he's randomly heard, and he's changing his medical opinion. But of course, that's not a big deal because he's going to completely abandon this mechanism in the future. First of all, in your reports, let's see if this is right. You said clearly 3 times the air at 2009 splintered the diaphragm, didn't you? I did, but I think the air destabilised him. So this is now the new theory that Dr. Evans writes in the Channel 5 letter. But then he throws in fluid as well. So he never mentions fluid during the court case, but then he starts saying, oh, the air and fluid destabilised the infant because he's been absolutely ridiculed on this idea. So now he's changed that completely. I think he had an extra dollop of air. So this is where he mentions the dollop of air. So he throws in the dollop of air in this case as well. So we're only a few pages into this. This goes on for 110 pages. So you can probably see I'm not going to finish this today. I'll go on for an hour. But it's just piling, as someone has described in relation to another aspect of this court case in my book, it's literally just piling the absurdities on top of one another in this case. So I don't know how far we're going to get into this court transcript, into this absolute train wreck, this embarrassment of this cross-examination, but you can see how bad it is so far. We've only done a few pages. I think he had an extra dollop of air in the morning of the 24th. I've said that now 3 times, and that's my opinion. So you're saying extra dollop of air. In other words, you're saying that the air in the abdomen at 20:09 still has a part to play in the following morning, some 13 hours later. So now he says, I don't think so. It might have, but it would not have led to the baby's collapse. I think for the baby to have collapsed, he must have had additional air just before 9:40 a.m. Because, we've dealt with this in similar cases in the trial. So now he's going back to say, hey, my medical opinion here is based on what I said earlier in the trial, where I said, child G was overfed with milk. He's going to start talking about now. Because, we've dealt with this in similar cases in this trial where there's been a volume of air injected into the stomach. Case number 7, baby G, was the most striking evidence. So we've seen this before. In this particular case, the sequence now for me clinically is straightforward. Is it? It's straightforward, is it? He had air injected into his stomach, which showed up on the x-ray of 2009. That compromised his feeding. They stopped his feeding correctly, but then he had an extra infusion of air into his stomach and that led to the collapse at 9:40. That is the clinical sequence of events, having listened to the evidence of nursing and medical staff in this particular case over the past few days. So let me emphasise again, he's just basing this on what he heard in court. So let's just go over at this point what we've learnt so far. So just in that last paragraph alone, Dr. Evans is saying, I have changed the time of the attack. I have written the previous date and time of attack in 3 previous reports. I am now changing the time and the date based entirely on comments made in court, which I was not even present to witness. The new theory that I have come up with is not written in any of my reports, and of course, I will later abandon this theory completely. I should mention as well that, remember, the critical thing in this infant is that the infant has a collapsed lung. The infant has a pneumothorax. That is very obviously what has led to the collapse of this infant. We're just abandoning this completely. We're not even discussing the pneumothorax, which is obviously the critical aspect of this infant. Now, there are many other absurdities that I've already discussed, but just in the previous paragraph alone, this is what Dr. Evans is saying. Right, let's have, Ben Meyer says, that is the sequence okay? Evans responds, I'm going to look at the evidence relating to that, but I make it plain, Dr. Evans. I suggest to you what you're doing again is coming up with ideas and theories to try to support the allegation rather than work just within the facts that we have. That is incorrect, because if I did that, I would have put more emphasis on air being injected into his stomach prior to 2009 if I was trying to fit the evidence. So that is incorrect. That's exactly what you've done. You've tried to say that it happened then, you've listened to this in the trial, and you've now invented an extra dollop before 9:40. I have not invented anything. I have said that there was an additional infusion of air into the stomach of this little baby sometime before 9:40 a.m. on the 24th of June. That is what I am now satisfied from a clinical perspective is what happened. I mean, this is such bullshit. It's complete bullshit. It's extraordinary that a conviction was secured on this case. It is mind-boggling that the science that has been... I mean, come on, it can't even be described as science. It's just absolute horseshit. It should never be allowed in a courtroom. This gentleman should never have been allowed in a courtroom in the first place. He should have been thrown out. Very obviously should have been thrown out by Goss when he was given the opportunity to do so. And the consequences of that not occurring is that someone has been wrongfully convicted. And you can see why when you look at this cross-examination. Your starting point remains 2009 at the night before, doesn't it? No, my starting point starts prior to 2009 because the x-ray was done at 2009. There was a lot of air in it by that time, so the air didn't get there at 2008, it must have been there for, maybe hours, I don't know. So he's saying there, he's conceding, he doesn't know. He doesn't know how long the air has been there. Obviously, Myers picks him up on this. So if he doesn't know how long the air has been there, then he cannot say that it was there deliberately, because the x-ray needs to be taken, as I mentioned, in a very short period of time after the demise of the infant in order to state that it was deliberately injected or deliberately introduced somehow. Otherwise, there are multiple reasons why it can be there accidentally, which is, of course, why the air is there. So Myers picks him up on this and says, you don't know, is that just a guess then? Of course, it is a guess. He says it's not a guess, it's a clinical assessment. It absolutely is a guess. There is no basis on which to say it's a clinical assessment. In fact, Myers should have picked him up on this and said, on what basis do you say that it's a clinical assessment? What medical evidence do you use to make this assessment? You've just said, I don't know how long it's been there. It's probably been there for several hours. But then you claim this is a clinical assessment. That's a complete joke anyway, but you should have been pressed on this, and they should have said to him, okay, if it's a clinical assessment, what clinical evidence do you use to make this assessment? Because there is no clinical evidence. But Ben Myers continues, let's deal from 2009 then, hearing what you have said. We're familiar with that x-ray, and Dr. Arthurs gave evidence about that. Moderate dilation, I think that's supposed to be. Not a large volume of air, in fact, is where we get with Dr. Arthur's evidence there. And so Evans claims, I think he said it was excessive, actually. I listened to his evidence, and he said it was excessive. I haven't got a print of his evidence, but I think he said it was excessive. We'll do this step by step. It's page 71 of the transcript for the 16th of March, since you take issue with what I've suggested. So obviously, I'm sure you can already tell, Ben Myers is going to be correct. I suggested to Dr. Arthurs it was within the normal limits of what could be considered mild dilatation. So maybe this is dilatation. I thought it was dilation. So let's just establish what is meant by dilatation. So dilatation is just a different spelling of dilation, seemingly. It seems to be some sort of medical term that is used sometimes. They switch here between dilatation and dilation. So I don't think it's necessarily a typo. It's just you can say dilatation or you can say dilation, seemingly. So I'll read this bit out again. We'll do this step by step. It's page 71 of the transcript for the 16th of March, since you take issue with what I've suggested. I suggested to Dr. Arthurs it was within the normal limits of what could be considered mild dilatation. It's line 22 on page 71, and he said, answer, I would go a bit further. I'd probably call it moderate dilation. Not excessive, Dr. Evans, moderate. That's the first thing. That's his evidence. He identified it was not a usual pattern. It wasn't normal to see so much air going down. That was unusual. But in terms of the quantity, first of all, he never described this as excessive. Are you ready to accept that? So this is the what Dr. Evans is about to say now is indicative of everything we know about him as a person. So he's obviously wrong, but he cannot say, yes, I accept that I'm wrong. What does he say? I haven't got a script in front of me, so you know. So he's not able to say, yes, actually, you're correct and I'm wrong. He very obviously is wrong. He has to try and say, well, you know, I mean, the guy is just a ridiculous, absurd buffoon, an embarrassment of a human being. If he wasn't so dangerous, it would be funny. Let's continue. At 2009, notwithstanding whatever you've said, there's certainly no suggestion of any baby collapsing or suffering from excessive air, is there? No evidence of a baby collapsing. The fact he was unable to tolerate his milk from the evening of the 23rd would suggest there was something amiss with him. He had a pneumothorax. You've identified that x-ray at 2009. Let's have a look at the blood gas record if we can. That's at tile 178, please. We'll go behind that. We can see there at 2027, so 18 minutes or thereabouts after the x-ray, there are decent blood gas readings, aren't there? Where are we now? Sorry, 23rd of June 2016, 2027. Oh, right, yes, there are normal gases, yes. They're normal gas readings, yes. Nothing there to indicate any issue with any excessive amount of air that has been put in at 2009, is there? Is there, Dr. Evans? It's a simple question. No, the gases are normal. All right, because you're saying to us there's a problem with air that goes in at that time, so I'm just seeing what the clinical evidence shows. This is material you've had all along, isn't it? So now we're going to hear Dr. Evans waffling on yet again. No, right. If a baby has had more air than you'd expect, it's unusual or whatever, then it doesn't necessarily follow that a volume of air will lead to a baby crashing. In other words, it might, I think the amount of air compromises ability to tolerate milk, but that doesn't necessarily follow that it would be so compromising as to interfere with his breathing. So here, it's not splintered the diaphragm, it's not caused the collapse, it's not compromised the infant. Here, the introduction of air has prevented the infant from being able to digest milk. And that's the clinical sign that he's citing. Now, if anyone has any comments on this in the comment section, I'm not going to comment any further on this. I think it's pretty clear what my opinion would be. But if anyone would like to comment on this, please let me know. And I think it's important to reflect at this point. Can you imagine what this trial would be like if you had actual credible, competent doctors in the court case for the defence? They would have laid out what occurred with a pneumothorax, and then by comparison, they would have Evans. And we'll look at Bohin for this infant in the future as well. They would have had this bullshit where Ben Myers is pulling him to pieces in the witness box. He's tearing him a new orifice, basically. And yet, because they never heard from a doctor, and because I think we've discussed this previously and other people have discussed this, this can be perceived as the jury as like a horrible barrister being nasty to the respected elderly doctor who's just trying to outline the fact that someone has been horrible to some babies. Look at the horrible barrister who's being paid loads of money, being nasty to him. When what he's doing is just exposing the fact that everything that Evans is saying is complete and utter crap. And Evans is being made to look like an idiot. But unfortunately, because they haven't heard medical opinion from the defence, this can all wash over them, be perceived incorrectly. In a retrial, it's so clear that the prosecution, if the prosecution relied on Evans and relied on Bowen and relied on Manarides and then put them up against the experts that exist now, they would be annihilated. It would be a slaughter. So, as I've said on a number of occasions, I think that splinting the diaphragm occurred on the following morning and would not have occurred but for the fact that the infant had an additional volume of air. If I did not make that clear in my reports of 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and 4 years ago, I am making it clear now. You didn't say it at all. It's not that you didn't make it clear. It's not in those reports. And you've completely changed your view based on what you've heard in court, and you weren't even in the room, and now you're going to change your opinion again and say, well, actually, it's not anything to do with splinting the diaphragm. So I'm going to try to get through the remainder as quickly as I can that we're going to discuss today, because we're going to stop approximately a quarter into this cross-examination. So we can resume this in the future. We can look at Bohin. I've got many more court transcripts available that we'll go through. It really is an extraordinary debacle. I was going to say spectacle, but debacle is a better description. So Ben Myers then says, tile 22 please, Mr. Murphy, for the observations, just to see what this air, any effect of this air that you're saying was in at 2009. If we can just go behind that, please. If we look at the top of it, we can see 24th of June, and we can see that where Sophie Ellis, as we're going to see, put in the entries from 2000 through to 600, and indeed we pick up at 09 with a new member of staff afterwards. Can you see 2000 to 600 across the top of that chart? Yes, yes. If we scroll down, please, through the readings, we're familiar with the chart, we've got it. No indication and nothing to support the suggestion that there is excessive air in the stomach that is in any way compromising that baby overnight, is there? So Evans claims that is incorrect. There's no evidence that it compromised his breathing. Okay. There's more to a baby than a pair of lungs. He's got a stomach and intestines as well, and I think it compromised his feeding. We'll come to that shortly. Not compromise his heart rate. I've said that, Evans responds. It didn't compromise his heart rate or his respiratory rate, and his saturations are normal, so it did not compromise his breathing. But I think it contributed to his difficulties with feeding. So then Myers says, if air is getting anywhere close to splinting a diaphragm, there's going to be some impact on breathing, isn't there? I think the splinting of the diaphragm occurred the following morning. But you are saying this air is there all night and an extra dollop is given the following morning, correct? Well, so far there's no indication of any problem. Do you agree? Sorry. No indication so far of any problem. No, I don't agree. There were feeding problems. So I would suggest to you that the feeding problems would be completely irrelevant. However, it'd be interesting to see what people say in the comments. I'm going to come to that now, Dr. Evans. Let's look at tile 24, please. We can see here again, we're familiar with these entries by Nurse Ellis. First of all, at 2000, 14 millilitres of milk were aspirated. That's correct, isn't it? Yes. No air as it happens. Well, nothing recorded. Well, if an extremely large amount of air came out, for instance, that would be recorded, wouldn't it? His answer to that is 14 millilitres of milk aspirated at 8 p.m. So he's avoiding the question. Maya says yes. That's a lot of milk, actually. So he's just completely avoiding. He's just completely avoiding the fact. He's just been questioned about the air. So he can't justify his position. So he just changes the subject. I mean, this guy is such a bullshitter. He's such a complete and utter bullshitter. It's embarrassing. In fact, that's the time before the X-ray, isn't it? Yes. Yes, and that's Nurse Ellis looking after him at that time, isn't it? Yes, yes. We know that's combined with another 15 millilitres and put back into the baby. Yes. Back into child P, isn't it? Yes. And at 2200, it seems no significant aspirate is taken, is there? It doesn't say. No. Not even with the air that you say would be present. There's none there. So far as aspirates, no air found in an aspirate at that time we have evidence of, is there? So then Evans says, if the air is in the intestine, you're not going to aspirate any air from the stomach, okay. So it's injected into the stomach. If you look at the x-ray carried out at 2009, and I'm not a radiologist, the air is in the intestines, it's not in the stomach. I'll stop you there, Dr. Evans, because I specifically asked Professor Arthurs about that, because I pointed out that the stomach looked a bit greyer, and he explained that does have air too, and he said not to be misled by the way it appeared on that, you may recall. So before we go any further, I just want to reflect on the fact that Dr. Evans, by his own account, has changed his medical opinion in the court case entirely based on what he's heard from people speaking in the court, and he can't even establish the details of this correctly. Every detail is incorrect, but that is the foundation of him changing his opinion and changing the date of the incident. So he says, sorry, what did Arthur say about air in the stomach? This is Evans speaking now. And Ben Meyer says that there is air there, and the fact that it is greyer on the x-ray doesn't mean there isn't air there. This is air in the stomach and in the intestines, Dr. Evans. And then Evans says, yes, I know, but we've seen in other cases where the stomach is very large because of air. So now he's saying, oh, well, we've seen this in other cases, so I'll just basically copy this into this case. He's not saying, he's not challenging the fact that he's wrong. He's not saying I'm not incorrect. He's just saying, oh, well, this has happened elsewhere, so I'm just allowed to say this now. If we carry on to 2400 hours, a total of 20 millilitres is now aspirated, isn't it? Yes. And as it happens at that time, there's no record of any air, is there? Not as far as I know, no. We've listened to the evidence, as you have. The first time there's any suggestion of abdominal distension from the nursing staff was actually from Kate Percival Calderbank, who said the abdomen appeared to be distended when she was called round about 4 o'clock. Do you remember that? So he's having to he's saying all these things and he's having to confirm the details. At 4 o'clock in the morning, yes. Yes. Do you recall that evidence? Yes, I do, yes. No suggestion of any distension before that point, as far as I recall. I would have to check, but that seems correct, yes. Let's look at this tile 237 carrying on into the morning. We'll have a look at that, please. At that time we see 25 millilitres of air is aspirated. Yes, I know. No record of any aspiration like that before this point, is there? No record of any aspiration of air before this point. And what the picture that emerges is that there's certainly something in baby P's condition overnight where we can see there haven't been feed suggested and air has been produced. That's right, isn't it? Yes. None of that air is identified as it happens in any aspirate before that point, is it? Right. Well, no. And no suggestion of abdominal distension before this point from the evidence we've had. Correct. Right. Later on, if we carry on, there's 5 millilitres of air aspirated at 700 hours. Yes. Do you agree with that? Yes. So whatever's going on, and whatever the condition is, to suggest that the air at 2009 is excessive and has been there as a potential problem all night is fanciful, Dr. Evans, isn't it? So now we're going to hear, it's very obvious that what Myers is saying is correct, but now we're going to see Dr. Evans attempting to defend his so-called medical opinion. No, it is not fanciful. We've discussed the x-ray and everybody says there's a lot of air in the intestine. Incorrect. It's already been established that that is not what was said. Again, if it's in the intestine, you're not going to aspirate it from a nasogastric tube. You can only aspirate air if it's in the stomach. So that's the first point. So we've established that there was air in the stomach, and that was the evidence of Professor Arthurs. In addition to that, let me emphasise that Dr. Evans has changed his opinion entirely on the basis of the opinion of Professor Arthurs, and he says other people that gave evidence in court, although he can't actually establish what was said and is incorrect about most of the details. Then he says, the second point is that I think that whatever was shown on the x-ray at 2009 is a marker and an explanation for why he was not tolerating his feeds. So all he is doing here is repeating what he said before, even though Ben Myers has just exposed the fact that everything he's saying is complete bullshit. But all he's saying is he's just saying it again. Okay, and it's an important one. It did not, as you said, it did not compromise his breathing, because if we look at his neonatal chart for the rest of the night, he remained in air and he was breathing normally. So we've just addressed this, he's just repeating himself. So his breathing was normal, and I suspect that this is because the oral feeds had stopped, therefore he was not receiving any oral feeds, and the fact that he was that they only got 5 millilitres of air out at 7 a.m. means that I think he was stabilising by that time actually, yes. And all of that's apparent from these clinical records, isn't it? Well, I think that was the sequence of events. All of this is apparent from these clinical records, isn't it, Dr. Evans? Yes, yes. So in other words, there was never any sensible basis for you, in 3 reports, to suggest that splinting the diaphragm at 20:09 led to a collapse 13 hours later. There was never any proper basis for that, was there? So the answer to that, of course, is no. And that's where we're going to leave this cross-examination, because there's 82 pages left. We can revisit this in the future. I'm just going to summarise what we've learnt from this cross-examination. So in summary, child P very obviously died from a pneumothorax that was mismanaged, with delays in recognition and treatment. As a comparison, Evans ignored a pneumothorax, also in the case of child H, instead making bizarre smothering allegations. When Ben Myers describes the theories of Dr. Evans in court as fanciful, it is a generous description. The child's initial abdominal gas distension was caused by CPAP, not by injected air. There was no evidence of air injection into the stomach or the intravenous line. Post-collapse care was mismanaged, and this led to persistent metabolic acidosis and worsening circulation/gas exchange. Child P is one of many infants in the court case in which a failure to diagnose caused undesirable clinical consequences, and these were then amplified by medical errors. This appears to be another avoidable death. The use of high-pressure ventilation and adrenaline were inappropriate for a baby with no lung disease and only 26% oxygen requirement. We see no mention of this from Dr. Evans. Throughout the court case, and child P is emblematic of this, Dr. Evans repeatedly changes his explanation over time, despite having no new medical information. In the case of child P, Evans provided multiple reports to Cheshire Police, then revised his opinion between them, particularly regarding the timing of supposed attacks and significance of the pneumothorax. Although child P is particularly egregious, because the explanation that Evans relies on in court is based on what he has heard during the court case, Evans in fact abandons his reports while giving evidence. It should be noted that Evans would later completely abandon this new mechanism cited in court. Evans, by his own admission, initially could not explain the collapse and had no clear medical cause, but later developed a theory involving air in the stomach. Evans shifted the alleged timing of the air event from the night shift to the morning of the 24th of June, based entirely on things he heard in court, rather than any meaningful diagnostic information. This new timing was not written in his early reports and was invented during the court case and then first introduced during cross-examination. Evans could not remember which report contained the relevant air and splinting the diaphragm theory. Evans moved away from the pneumothorax explanation and instead focused on abdominal air and diaphragm splinting. The pneumothorax had been included in 3 reports. Later, when challenged in court, Evans claims that the evidence for air down the nasogastric tube is the inability to tolerate feeds, not the splinting that he centrally referenced. The presence of abdominal air in the X-ray could have been natural or incidental. Indeed, it is 99.999% likely was, and Evans had no proper basis to claim it was injected. Evans admitted that he couldn't be certain how long the air had been present, which means that he also cannot meaningfully assert that it was introduced deliberately. It was clear from cross-examination that Evans was not clear on multiple details related to the court testimony on which he is entirely reliant. The baby's blood gases were normal shortly after the X-ray, which was rightly cited by Ben Myers as evidence that the amount of air could not cause severe collapse. The aspirated fluids recorded overnight did not show a clear air problem before the morning, undermining the claim that the X-ray represented a dangerous air load. Evans repeatedly fell back on the idea that the X-ray air explained feeding problems, but not breathing collapse, which is inconsistent with what is written in his reports. Evans never gave a sensible basis for concluding that splinting the diaphragm at 20:09 led to a collapse 13 hours later. Evans also focused on which nurse was on duty rather than on the medical evidence. It is notable that he explicitly excluded doctors from this process, indicating that he was focused on a nurse, as also indicated by early Hummingbird documents. A proper medical examination or explanation would have centred on pneumothorax and mismanagement, not on these arcane injected air theories. The cross-examination exposed Evans, and the prosecution case would have been annihilated if challenged by competent defence experts. Finally, I'd just like to point out, I have no medical or scientific background. I'm the first person to concede this, and you can see how easy it is for me to pull this apart. So one can only imagine how painful it is for people with medical qualifications to hear this. You can only imagine how painful it would have been for anyone in court with qualifications. It must have been painful for Michael Hall to sit there and listen to all of this. This was an absolute calamity, a debacle, an embarrassment, a shambles, and numerous other things. There is no prospect whatsoever that Child P collapsed or died due to the injection of air into the stomach, but that's no surprise because even Dr. Evans doesn't suggest that the mechanism that he utilised in court was actually the reason that this baby died.